So in terms of sculpting and brush settings, again, this is somewhat similar to the default layout, but if you click on your brush here, you have access to a whole bunch of brushes, and they are organized in some interesting ways. So we've got brushes that start with the letter B. There's only one, which is the blob brush. Brushes that start with the letter C. So there's chisel brushes, there's clay tubes, there's curved brushes, there's all sorts of stuff. So, and if you hit B anywhere in your interface, right, it'll pop up this pretty full menu of brushes. So that's really great. Um, I'll go back to the standard brush. So you can hit B for brush, S for standard, and you see it isolates the S category. So some people, what they will do is actually memorize the kind of combination. And T, if you take a look in the upper left corner, is the standard brush shortcut. So if you go BST, that'll get you to your, sorry, I must have hit something by accident. BST will get you to the standard brush, okay? And you can change, many brushes have a few options within their settings. And so these are complementary, the stroke option and the alpha. So I'll show you, usually standard is set to dots. Freehand is almost like a smoother version of this. So you get a much more fluid arc. Fluid curve, let's say, in your line, and I'm going to just up the intensity. By the way, there is Z intensity for the stroke intensity. So if you take a look at max intensity, it's really coming out quite a bit. There's draw size, so that's the overall size, right, of the brush. By the way, S is for draw size. U is a shortcut for intensity. As mentioned, you can right click and actually access these. And there's a secondary. So if you notice, the standard brush doesn't have any alpha. So what's actually happening, again, for you Photoshop pros, if you take a look, right, the inner circle of the brush, it's almost like the hardness softness setting of a Photoshop brush. So the inner circle is 100% effectiveness. The outer circle is like a gradient from 100 to 0. So it goes from 100% on the inner to 0 on the outside. Most of the time with the standard brush, I don't adjust it, but if I think O is the focal shift, so you go minus 100, the two circles overlap, so you have a very, very harsh overlap. And if I just dial it back a little bit, O for focal shift, right? Dial it back a little more, right? You get a much harder edged stroke. If you go the other way, right? So you have a tiny focal point in the middle and a lot of fall off. So it becomes kind of a softer sculpting brush, right? So those are some really important functions. Many times I leave focal shift at 0. There's one time where I will almost always set it to minus 100, and I'll show you that now. If we go into alpha, so if we can load alphas in, and these are just pre-built ones, pre-packaged ones. You can import your own as well. But let's say we go into this and we drag out these arrows. Right? If I drag this in, you'll see there's a whole bunch of arrows there, right? In a kind of pattern. Now, let's say you wanted to drag one of these out. Well, you can do that by clicking on the freehand and say, let's go to drag rectangle. So you can now drag one out. Like I said, by default, your focal shift is set to 0. So if you're trying this out, I often had this problem for a while and I didn't quite know how to fix it. But you see there's a fading out at the edges. That's because of the focal shift, right? That focal shift is set to 0. So there's kind of a fading happening. So if you go, this is the one instance where I'd set my focal shift to minus 100 to get a nice full drag out of that pattern. If you hold Alt, we can drag it the other way, right? So there's really, really cool ways to kind of use these tools with one another. So I will sometimes block out eyes in this way, or, kind of figure out some shapes and kind of go from there. So that's, there's interesting ways to combine these. Another really cool trick is I sometimes use color spray. So I'm using color spray to drag these dots out, or these little circles. So you can actually have spray and color spray are different in that color spray will take any color loaded into your brush and vary the color, whereas spray will take whatever color or non-color and the alpha and just vary that with no change in the color itself. In this case, I just have a white brush, white color on the brush, so there's no color really being added to this. Underlying this system, by the way, if you switch colors, the whole mesh can change color. It's kind of like an autofill, if you will. So we'll come back around to this in a little bit. And the same thing with the materials. So you actually have materials that will just kind of autofill when you click on them. But we can actually paint in just color only. We can paint in materials into certain sections, or we can paint both. those are little button options at the bottom called RGB, right? So when you switch this on, your brush will now, it can sculpt and paint at the same time. Z add, by the way, is near the top here. This is actually the direction of the brush. So I'll turn off RGB because I don't want to paint color. But if I set it to Z sub, that's subtract. So what's happening is when you hit Alt, it's actually almost inverting the direction of that brush, right? So typically in the standard brush, even with color spray and this alpha, it's pulling out, but when I hold Alt, it's going to push in. So those are some really kind of key features, I would say, to the brush settings inside of ZBrush, and some of the basic material and color settings. So as I mentioned in my interface, I do have these custom buttons, custom brushes at the bottom. So if you notice, next to them is a number. The top row here has numbers, the bottom ones don't. I haven't mapped these to shortcuts, but my sort of top 10 brushes I've mapped to hotkeys. And then I've got some alternate brushes for smoothing. I've got a couple alternate masking and cutting brushes and things like that. But you can always, like I said, use the combo keys as well. So you could, B for brush, and then maybe N for something. I'm not sure what's under N, like nudge. I've never used nudge before. Or noise. Let's see what noise does. Oh, noise throws in some really cool texture. Right, so you can kind of play with those kind of pre-built keyboard shortcuts. Something else too to mention, when you're using brushes, let's say you customize one, you can save these. So if you click on the brush icon itself, you can say, hey, I want to save this customized standard brush as something. So you could save it as, your ring brush, for example. And then you can reload that and bring it with you to other places. Sometimes what I do if I'm messing around with enough settings and enough different brushes, but I just kind of want to go back to the defaults, you can just say reset all brushes. That'll kind of reset the brush palette back to its kind of standard defaults. So one other thing I'd like to mention, sometimes if you do have a pattern and you want to change or alter the spacing, right? Let's say we drag this out. You see it's very, very close together, these strokes, right? And I may want to separate them a little bit more. There's a little function in ZBrush called lazy mouse. It was actually invented for people who are kind of stuck without a mouse, or people like me who can't always draw a very good straight line or very fluid curve. Sometimes it gets kind of wobbly and you don't want to sit there for half an hour redrawing to get the right curve and the right stroke. This is a mode that you turn on or off. Once it's on until you turn it off again. And I'll show you a few different settings. There's lazy smooth. So if I crank this and you drag, right, it'll be a little bit more fluid. And then there's lazy step. So this is lazy smooth, and lazy smooth and radius I use together. So radius is almost like the distance between where your stroke starts, and you see there's a little red line. And it can get very large. So if I crank that way up, you'll see there's a huge line, but I'll get a much more kind of fluid stroke out of that, right? Now, that's not what I want to use this for exactly. So I'm going to set these back down to basically their lowest setting, 0 for smooth and 1 for radius. What I want to show you is the step. Okay, if I turn the step down, you'll see that that line will get much more solid. But if I turn it up, so the default is 0.25. If I turn up to like maybe 0.65, I get more separation. If I turn it up in a higher amount, let's say to 1 or higher, I'll get much better stepping, right? So if you wanted like a kind of pattern or a texture repeat, just playing with the step number, increasing it, and you can get more separation, let's say. And sometimes I've sculpted a custom alpha where it's got some cool, for creature stuff, I'll sculpt a cool little textural pattern, and then I will increase the stepping. Now, where this is also useful, if I have no alpha and I'm just using my standard brush, right? Sometimes when you draw fast, you might see a separation in brush stroke like this, right? It may not be that bad. Usually, like I said, the default of 0.25, if we brush out, is usually not too bad. But I've seen in some cases where, maybe if the setting's a little bit higher, you see it's kind of broken, that sort of stroke. You can just sort of dial it down. I usually go as low as 0.025, actually. But yeah, depending on the scenario, you may not need to. So if your stroke is looking kind of broken up, then you might have to, tweak that step distance setting. Now, the last thing I want to mention is just the color settings. So you can hit B for brush, P for paint. There's a paintbrush. Actually, what the paintbrush is literally the standard brush with the Z add turned off. And if we go down into color, RGB is turned on. So by default, RGB on the standard brush is off and Z add is turned on. With Z add on, typically what you want to do, if you're filling your object with just flat white to start, that's fine. You can pick your color over here. But let's say, like I said, without any color actually painted on or added on initially, ZBrush will autofill your object with a color, right? And so if you want that to be permanently part of the object, you have to hit fill object. So now the object is filled. And if I switch colors, right, now I can actually paint those colors on, right? And what's cool about this, just like the standard brush, sculpting brushes, we can say, hey, let's go to color spray. Let's throw on an alpha. And now we got some texture going, right? We can actually do all sorts of crazy stuff by chaining together the type of brush stroke, the type of alpha. We can actually even load texture. So you can actually load images into this. So I just picked this kind of pre-built whatever. There's some really gross textures. They should update these, but like a really old wood texture that's low res, some grass texture. So let's say I take this circle thing and go to drag. I can drag this out now. And remember, focal shift also affects this, right? So if I undo that and redraw it out, you see I get that nice target with the grass texture in it. So there's some really crazy ways we can, it's amazing. It's simple in a lot of ways. So that's RGB. And if you kind of want to reset the color, I usually would just set it to kind of flat white and go to fill object. Oops, make sure texture is off, fill object. So that kind of resets the color in a way. You can actually even paint in. So if I turn off RGB, but then turn on material, if I paint now with this material on and then switch it, that area will be left behind. So you can actually apply materials to certain areas. I generally don't do that. I usually just leave my object kind of filled with a material. So to reset materials, again, it's a bit of a weird thing, but you have to go to flat material, flat color, make sure M is on for material, and then go to fill object. And it kind of like resets it. So now you can kind of go back and switch between any other material, right? Kind of do the autofill. When you are doing like texturing and texture painting, I often use Skin Shade 4 and flat color to sort of just look at the texture itself. When I'm sculpting, I tend to use a lot more of these kind of like clay style gray materials and shiny materials. And I often recommend switching between materials while sculpting. Again, I'm going to just reset all my brushes. So that's kind of a brief intro. And you can, by the way, in Paintbrush or Standard Brush, turn on mRGB, which will fill the object with material and color. And if you're just looking to paint with standard, you can turn off Z add or switch to B for brush, P for paint. And A is that shortcut. BPA is the shortcut chain for that. So people will often kind of pick these up or maybe sort of write them out and then practice them as they go to get kind of more proficient at that. So